Thank you very much for this introduction. I will present some findings or ideas deriving from my ongoing PhD project. My presentation focuses on various forms of non-industrial food provisioning and short food supply chains. And I take these alternative agri-food practices as a field or a context to investigate both, as Petra already said, precarity and agency in rural peripheries, with a particular focus on less privileged persons. So, non-industrial food provisioning and short food supply chains are often placed in scientific discourse into two somehow separate categories or registers, I would say. So on the one hand, we have literature that highlights alternative food chains, such as community gardens, for example, farmers markets, on-farm shops, community-supported agriculture. And they are considered as forms of social innovations based on establishing new relations between consumers and producers. They're linked to consumer citizenship and ethical consumption. They can, however, also add to the commodification of rurality. And they represent rather privileged middle classes modes of food provisioning. And research has shown that they can contribute to the reproduction of various social inequalities, for example, when they make food purchase more time consuming or might devaluate consumers of conventional foodstuff. And so they constitute marginalized forms of provisioning in many societies of the global north. However, they are arguably a very popular field of research which has gained tremendous attention over the last decade or 15 years or so. On the other hand, literature attends to short food supply chains through the register of food self-provisioning, so the production of own, foodstuff, informal exchange and sell within networks of families, neighbors, work colleagues, and so on. And here, research from the Central Eastern European context has shown that these practices enjoy broad participation across social classes. We have heard a lot about it yesterday in Petra Riehliča's talk. And they've also been identified, or it has also been noted that the ideal of self-sufficiency is still rather powerful in Central Eastern Europe, and even regaining currently momentum in the wake of debates on ecological transition, on conscious consumption, on the sharing economies. And these are they meet with the frames of alternative food networks. And last but not least, they have been identified as drivers of rural to urban lifestyle mobility. And I am interested in moments when both seemingly dichotomous modes of thinking or registers interact. My research took place in a peripheralized rural region of Western Czech Republic. It is comparatively sparsely populated with rather difficult accessibility of services and employment opportunities. In the region, agriculture has been an important field of employment in socialism, and today the region is marked by a more diversified yet largely low-wage labor market. It is not one of the typical popular destinations for rural tourism. However, the region attracted during my time of the presence in the field urban to rural lifestyle migrants from the creative class with sustainability-centered lifestyles. They will play a role in the presentation in a while. I combined interviews and ethnographic fieldwork. I did problem-centered interviews with rural dwellers across social milieux, speaking with them about their everyday arrangements and their experience of the region. And I did ethnographic field research at various sites of small-scale agri-food work. And in my dissertation/book project, which I'm working on, I used this material to add to several debates. So this is the debate on diverse economies and their contribution to resilience in rural peripheries. I'm interested in perception and implications of precarity and working poor. And I'm interested in also in lifestyle mobility, lifestyle migration, and its impact on rural peripheries and less privileged rural dwellers. And I've also listed some of the papers that have resulted already from the research. So the people I met in the field spoke with me about or gave me access to a broad range of informal agricultural practices. This included, for example, growing foodstuff in kitchen gardens, holding livestock for own consumption or for sharing. It also included short food chains in the sense of occasional at-door sale of home-produced products such as eggs, cheeses to neighbors, second house owners, and so on. And I also was pointed to some cases of comparatively large surplus production intended for regular informal sale. So here it is important to stress that these were only very few households actually who did this like large production intended for regular sale, but they were often referred to by the lifestyle migrants I met in the region with very high appreciation. And I want to demonstrate this on one quote. One of the lifestyle migrants talks here about help he does at one of those large producers, or large scale producers during harvest. He says, "It's just great. If you have a big plot of land and a big outcome, it's a lot of work to harvest it. And the greatest thing is to just call your neighbors and say, let's go harvesting. We always got a sack of potatoes. It probably would be easier to earn the money somewhere else and to buy the sack of potatoes from that money. But helping out with the harvest really is an experience. It's like going to a festival somewhere. The farmer bakes a cake for everyone and it really turns into an event where people meet and chat. I really enjoyed helping out with the harvest, whether at that man's place or elsewhere. And I think it's slowly developing here. The gardens of those lifestyle migrants need time, but when there are more gardens and crop, we'll also hold such harvesting events." And I think this quote very well transport how such contacts to informal farmers with large surplus production who had practiced this over a long period of time already, reaching back to socialism, resonated very well with those lifestyle migrants' ideas or ideals of rural self-sufficiency and confirmed their aspirations and the potential they ascribed to their own farming activities and attempts to build small food chains themselves. At the same time, these encounters provoked social distinctions and mutual irritations. For example, the lifestyle migrants were irritated over the amount of meat consumption of those like farmers they met, and over the discovery that these producers did occasionally use pesticides and also bought convenient foodstuff. And I want here to underline the heterogeneity of scopes of non-industrial agri-food practices I met in the field, but also the similarity of different paths of development of these practices. So in the field, there was the simultaneity of decline and reduction of farming, of informal farming, and this was also pointed out quite regularly. But there also was continuity, expansion, there was novelty and aspiration. To the informal producers on all scales, their agricultural work was experienced as a source of agency in various aspects. So it earned them, for example, recognition across social milieux, reproduced social capital. Also providing oneself and loved ones with good food was experienced as acts of good care and more specifically good mothering in the field. And it enabled them to build bonds with past generation and to experience biographic continuity. However, in the context of my fieldwork, food self-provisioning and the sale of surpluses was also experienced as a practice to mitigate a broadly shared feeling of precarity, which was linked to working poor and over-indebtedness. So I will show you how one informal farmer who worked full-time in a hotel put it. And we see here this very explicit notion of agency. Let me give you an example. Some chambermaids are working at our hotel. They're single mothers with 2 kids each, and they truly earn 9,000 korunas, 340 euros. And with this money, they have to feed 2 children of school age. And you know, when these women go shopping, they have to count every penny instead of buying meat. So in this respect, by contrast, we do have an advantage. We just head to the freezer and make a schnitzel or whatever we want. This woman can't do that. That's really common here. These are working poor. So low wages and the mobility costs necessary for assessing labor in towns were one of the central issues my informants identified and felt personally affected as well. So many of my informants sought to generate extra incomes through informal earnings and casual work. And in this context, consuming and selling their own food was part of their broad complex, heterogeneous repertoire of diversified economic strategies. And I had especially men here talking about these practices, these food practices, in a very entrepreneurial spirit, like of seizing opportunities, of identifying room to maneuver. And I want firstly to argue that it is really important to take serious the economic agency emerging or being ascribed to food self-provisioning and the sale of surpluses. Because it transported the experience of being resilient to hardship, of being able to participate in unconstrained consumption, and to preserve autonomy and control. And at the same time, I want to stress that this agency is highly produced in a relational sense, like in the way that it was a lot about stressing that that this ability derived from being able to navigate this omnipresent precarity and financial vulnerability better than other peoples from the direct network. My second point is that this economic agency and the notions of having advantages over others was interrelated also with their formal employment. So not only in this relational or symbolic dimension, which came across in this quote I had just shown you, but also in a very practical sense of being able to access key resources through formal employment. This concerned the consumers of their products, for example. Some producers took their crop, their vegetables, their meat, their cheeses to their workplaces in town and sold them here to colleagues or to other contacts around the workplace. And they also received or could recruit occasional farm help from their colleagues at work. And formal employment also helps to obtain livestock. For example, in this pot which you can see here on the picture, a producer was cooking very different leftovers, convenient food, which he had gained through various sources at his job in a large city, and he always took them to the village, cooked them there, and then use it to feed the pigs. So, and also lastly, to those with local employment, it was also an opportunity to use the land and the buildings they worked at formally to pursue private agricultural activities. So my fieldwork, however, took place in a period when alternative food networks gained tremendous popularity and visibility across the Czech Republic. So there has been a boom in so-called farmers markets, not only in the metropoles, as you can see here in the graph, but also in regional and small centers. And more recently, the concept of community-supported agriculture has resonated very well in Czech Republic, and the number of initiatives is growing. And there's also a willingness, this is the third example, of public institutions to fund a direct sales promotion as a tool to support smallholders. So this leads me actually to the question, to which extent can informal producers I met in the field benefit from this growing popularity or recognition or visibility of alternative food networks? So do these spheres interrelate, and which implications does that have? And I will draw from 3 examples from my field. So the first case takes us to a farmer's market. One of the informal producers I worked with in my field, I call him Milan, had gained access to a large farmer's market at an attractive urban locality. He was invited there by a lifestyle migrant who was building up an organic farm at the village where Milan lived. This lifestyle migrant was really active in the Czech and also European food movement, and thus learned early about the establishment or the plans to establish this new farmers market, and obtained the possibility to rent a market stall there. He had already been in contact with Milan earlier to consult him, amongst others, on the purchase of some agricultural tools. And when he gained then permission to sell at the farmers market, he offered Milan to share the spot with him, to buy his own foodstuff in exchange for being allowed to use Milan's van to transport the products to the market. He did not own such a van himself. So Milan himself had owned products to sell because he cared for some small pieces of land which were in the possession of his family. In socialism, and actually also quite a long period after still, his family had sold the products informally, but had then downsized the production to a much smaller amount in the last years. So the lifestyle migrant soon concluded that his large network and his ability to gain EU funding for his activities offered him more sustainable options for securing his livelihood, and he stopped the trips to the farmers market. Milan, however, continued. What is more, he once again began to use the family's land more intensively for production. For example, he revitalized the potato field and planted new trees and so on. And he used, therefore, on the one hand, knowledge and practices from the time that he, as a young boy, had helped his grandfather with production for this then time informal sale. At the same time, he also went into new directions. On the market, he had witnessed how attractive some kinds of vegetables were to urban clients. And he then proceeded to complete the products his grandfather already had taught him to grow with this, in his eyes, modern vegetables, such, for example, Hokkaido pumpkin. So you can see how this farmers market fostered the reactivation of agriculture knowledge, tools, and also land, but also triggered change and innovation on a very basic level or small scale level. Reflecting on his arrangements, Milan highlighted that in contrast to his peers with whom he went to school in the village and so on, and who he told me were indebted or had been forced to move from the village for economic reasons, he was capable to stay and make a living. So again, here is this very explicit mentioning or stressing of agency. However, and this is why I think this case is particularly interesting, Milan's presence at the market also gave him a notion of political agency. Milan offered his products to actually a much lower price than other people at the market. That was also the case for the berries he grew, which were really popular and were always sold out really quickly. So he could have easy and with no risk asked for more money for these berries. However, he told me that he considered the market as being dominated by middlemen instead of real farmers like himself. And his price policy, he told me, was intended to make these unjust practices of middlemen visible and to financially hurt them. So, and I think you can see how the farmers market was a site of experiencing himself, or through which Milan experienced himself as a political agent, I would claim. The next case is a distillery. It's a distillery for fruit brandy located in my research region. It was newly established during my presence in the field and managed by a group of highly skilled urban dwellers who had in part recently moved to the village and engaged in various projects of heritage preservation, sustainable rural development, and social innovation. The distillery provided an infrastructure to legally produce fruit brandy for own consumption, which means that every owner of a piece of land could bring his or her fermented fruit to the distillery and have them at a given time transformed into brandy, fruit brandy. And it accepted, in contrast to other distilleries I got to know, it accepted already rather small amounts of fermented fruit. And it addressed thus clients with just a few trees in their private gardens and enabled them not being forced to pool their fermented fruit with those of other clients, but to receive fruit brandy exclusively made from their own fruit. The clients were invited to be present during this process, to assist in some steps of the distillation, and they could also design a personalized label to stick later on the bottles they produced, of this liquor they produced. The distillery I found during my presence at the venue resonated very well with residents of the region, with and without former experience in producing own alcohol. It formed, I would say, a contact zone between producers from various social backgrounds, linked by their appreciation of homemade brandy. What is more, it created the opportunity to have one's own skills assessed. So it was necessary to document the amount of produced poor alcohol for tax reasons. So the managers were therefore able to provide their clients with very exact information about how much alcohol their fermented fruit had obtained, and if the outcome per liter was above or below the average. And they were also very happy to let their clients peek into like a big Excel table that contained the data of basically all clients and made it as possible to compare their own performances with those of others. Being capable producers of alcohol, own alcohol, and having this confirmed by data gave recognition to people I met at the venue that could compete with other realms of recognition. For example, during the long hours I spent with one client in the distillery, he told me about his current boss, and he presented me with a somewhat ideal post-socialist success story of how this boss has moved from a manual worker into being the owner of a company, a villa, and a second house. Whereas he himself, so my contact person there, had stayed like a normal manual worker. However, he didn't speak in this venue during making the alcohol. He didn't speak about this in a bitter tone or through a frame of social injustice and working poor, which I had so often encountered during interviewing. But he linked it with an anecdote about his boss's recent unsuccessful attempt to produce own fruit brandy. So the boss's fermentation process has somehow failed, the product got spoiled, and it earned this boss quite a big laughter, he told me, from his colleagues, the employees who had, and they joked that next time this big employer or businessman should bring his fruit to him, to this client who was talking to me, who would surely manage much better than he himself. So, and later that day, this client was really tremendously satisfied when he then learned from the manager of the distillery that he indeed had been able to produce an above average outcome of alcohol from his own fruit. My third example is from fieldwork I did during a direct sales promotion day at an organic farm in the region. It was part of a series of similar events that was organized by a national public body or a public institution. The idea or the script of the event was to bring together local producers with local consumers in order to foster a spirit of consumer citizenship, educate the local population on the benefits of regional consumption, short food chains, and to motivate them to support local smallholders. Part of the event day was a farmer's market with regional products. However, the local host who was responsible to invite those farmers to the market used his extended national network, and ultimately no producer at the market was from the region. However, this was not seen as a larger problem or contradictory, but it was explained by those managers with the history of land ownership in the region, the rupture in the wake of the expulsion of the German population in the region after the Second World War. So in short, they accepted that there was a lack of local smallholders. While it was acceptable at this moment to not have local farmers on an event promoting local consumption, the concept of the event excluded informal producers, local informal producers. And one of the organizers told me that he really appreciated homemade food, but he also told me that it is an event of a public institution with public money funded, so he could only allow such farmers to the event that were formally registered as producers. So on the one hand, this could serve as an example of how state-initiated promotion of short food chains can contribute to rendering invisible informal food production. On the other hand, it were the visitors of the event themselves who destabilized this dichotomy and these hierarchies of formal and informal local production. I observed, for example, how the visitors did not stay in their assigned roles of being consumers, willing to learn about the possibilities to purchase local food through short food chains. When they interacted with the farmers, also with me and other visitors, they also identified themselves as producers of own foodstuff. They spoke actually very self-confident and kind of on the same level about their agricultural work and constructed linkages between their own gardening activities and those of the people who sold their foodstuff there, those former farmers. So to conclude, I have highlighted the plurality of modes, scopes, and paths of non-industrial food production and short food chains. I have argued that under the condition of precarization, informal food production is a subjectively highly important part of economic bricolages of rural dwellers. In this respect, economic agency arising from or being ascribed to informal food provisioning must be taken serious by precarity research, as well as must be taken serious the experience of recognition and autonomy transported through these practices. And I have also demonstrated on 3 examples the ambiguous effects of the rising popularity of alternative food networks for those informal farmers from less privileged backgrounds. So at least in my field, I found that alternative food networks can expand the scope of action of rural dwellers. They can produce contact zones that enabled recognition and visibility of informal farmers, but they also made hierarchies of different modes of small-scale producers visible. And my last remark is that it would be also tremendously interesting to attend more closely to the implication alternative food networks, which I found were often driven by the urban creative class, so which implementations they have for the political agency of informal farmers and rural dwellers. Thank you very much.